I would like to start by thanking Professor Danka and Professor Sisselman and the organizing committee for inviting me to take part in this really great event. I wish I could have gone in person to Bucharest, but I acknowledge that it's impossible in the present conditions. So it's my pleasure to be with you online, and my presentation to a great extent will complement Cornelia Helfrich's one. But my focus will be mainly on mystical poetry in general, and more specifically on Fernando Rielo's mystical poetry. I'm gonna share my, my screen with you. Just a second. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm going to deal with Rielo's mystical poetry. I would start by letting you know some facts about his personality, though Cornelia Helfrich touched upon this in her presentation, but very shortly, for you to know a bit more about his work and his contribution to literature, as well as ontology and mysticism. Fernando Rielo is a mystical poet, as I intend to show in this presentation, but he has not only left a genuine mystical work, he was also an original philosopher, though he preferred to call himself a metaphysician. He was also an essayist and a patron of the arts. He created a world prize for mystical poetry that, since its appearance in 1981, has not ceased to be held annually, and which has promoted in the Spanish-speaking world, as well as in the English-speaking world, mystical poetry, allowing its renewal and modernization, its dissemination and prestige. He was born in Madrid in 1923 and died in New York in 2004. He moved to New York in 1988 for medical reasons, specifically after suffering the amputation of a leg to be treated in a New York rehabilitation center. He never returned to Spain during those 16 years in New York. He published 11 books of poetry, from the initial Garden Tree, Dios y Árbol in Spanish, in 1958, to the last one, The Children of the Encounter, Los Hijos del Encuentro in Spanish, in 1999. He has another book, still unpublished, Symphony Opus 12. These are the headlines I'm going to develop. First of all, the meaning of mysticism. Then I'll comment upon this question. I'm wondering whether mysticism and mystics are reliable. Then, after that, what is mystical poetry? In the fourth place, Rielo's renewal of Spanish mystical poetry. Rielo is a very creative poet, and he doesn't repeat classical mystical poetry. He contributes by renewing the Spanish mystical poetry. And finally, some renewing features of his poetry. First of all, the meaning of mysticism. Mysticism has traditionally been seen in Christian spirituality as a path reserved for a few. Its very etymology refers to the secret, the hidden. The Greek noun mysterion evolved into the noun and adjective mystes mistu, which originated the term mystikos, mystike, mystikon, which finally gave rise to the word mystical or mystic. All these terms have the verbal root mieo, which means to close, especially the eyes and mouth. The original meaning, therefore, is that which is closed or hidden to the senses, and which is only open to the understanding of the one who experiences it. Hence, mysticism refers to mystery, a term that appears several times in the Greek version of the Old Testament and in some of the books of the New Testament. In the book of Daniel, for example, it means secret. And in the Apocalypse, it refers to that which, belonging to the future, is hidden to be revealed in time. St. Paul sometimes speaks of the mysteries of God to refer to the profound wisdom of God, which belongs to him alone, but which he has revealed to men in faith. We are not going to deal with all the semantic variants of mysticism or mysteries. We are only interested in making clear what is given in the origin of the world, the secret and mysterious that is not within the reach of the uninitiated. Hence, mysticism has come to mean the interior experience, elevated and difficult to define, because it is mysterious, that a person has of divine realities. In a simpler way, mysticism has to do with the experience of unitive love of a person with God. Are mysticism and mystics reliable? Is there any ground for mysticism and mystics to be relied upon? One of the problems that derive from these antecedents that we have mentioned is the authenticity of the mystical experience. If the content of this experience is hidden from the senses, from natural rationality, and if this experience belongs only to those who have managed to penetrate into the intimacy of divine knowledge, everything seems to fall into the realm of the mysterious and exclusive. In fact, the mystics in any religion have always been considered heterodox, and mysticism has not belonged to the mainstream of religions. It has moved in the periphery. Mysticism is often suspected of subjectivism and not infrequently of deviation. What we are discussing here refers at bottom to whether mysticism has any ontological foundation. It can be said that in this lies the central point of the mystical life, with its experience and its poetic expression. It has often been seen as a set of singular and exclusively subjective phenomena, with no other value than the merely individual. To what extent is the mystical experience nothing but a selfish escape from the world, from concrete commitment, from fraternal love? Mysticism has always suffered from the problem of developing in the field of phenomenology and extraordinary events. Hence, mystical life has been identified with miracles, levitations, ecstasies, bilocation, suspension of time. Here, however, lies one of the great contributions of Rielo. To put it clearly, Rielo has subtracted mysticism from phenomenology and has given it an ontological foundation. I want to clarify that Rielo doesn't deny that there are mystical phenomena, and mystical phenomena are true, but he goes beyond phenomenology and he tries to put forward a grounding for an ontological grounding for mysticism. We don't have time to develop this ontological foundation in the present presentation in the former presentation by Cornelia Helfrich. That explanation was provided. Nor is it the subject of this conference, of this presentation, but in a very summarized form, Let us say that Rielo affirms that the divine persons create the human spirit. This created human spirit assumes a psychosoma, and at the same time, the divine persons vivify this created psychosomatized spirit through their constitutive divine presence, which is biblically signified by the image and likeness with which God creates men and women. The divine constitutive presence of the divine persons in the created human spirit makes the human person a mystical deity defined by the metaphysical divinity. Therefore, for Rielo, man is, by definition, a mystical being by virtue of the constitutive divine presence. In Rielo's own words, the Most Holy Trinity is God by nature, the human being, God by grace. The human being is a deity formed in the image and likeness of the divinity by the divinity itself. There are, moreover, many definitions of a human being. None of them renders man so sublime as this one does. Philosophers take what is purely accidental and even anecdotal in man as a definition. This is a passage from Fernando Rielo, A Dialogue with Three Voices. This has fundamental theoretical and vital consequences. Mysticism refers to the very being of the human person, to their constitutiveness, and does not need to be associated with extraordinary phenomena for its understanding and development. It is evident that this mystical being is in the human person for its growth. Mysticism is incremental, depending upon the human being's response to the spiritual patrimony signified by the constitutive divine presence in his created spirit. On account of their mystical or ontological status, human beings, from the first instant of their conception, are betrothed to God, that is, united, constituted, and related. Mystical life, in keeping with this definition of man, is the incrementing by way of grace of the immanent constitutive presence of the divine persons in the human person. We cannot speak then in Rielo's mystical conception of an exclusive experience only for a few associated with the exceptional. Man is a mystical animal. Next, what is mystical poetry? Before we delve into Rielo's mystical poetry, it is convenient to define this conceptual aspect. What does Rielo understand by mystical poetry? Let us begin by stating that Rielo's conception is preceded by a literary twofold background in Spain, that of classical mystical poetry in the Spanish Golden Age, especially St. John of the Cross's poetry, and that of Spanish religious poetry in the 20th century. We will refer to the poetry of St. John of the Cross below. Let us now turn our attention to Spanish religious poetry of the 20th century. From Unamuno onwards, the religious theme is present in the work of many Spanish authors. Among them, perhaps the best known are Juan Ramón Jiménez, Antonio Machado, Damaso Alonso, Blas de Otero, José Hierro. Damaso Alonso famously stated in Poetas Españoles Contemporáneos, contemporary Spanish poets, that all poetry is religious, in the sense that all poetry seeks God directly or indirectly, and that in this search there is often failure, protest, and rebellion. Alonso even speaks in the aforementioned work of two types of religious poetry, rooted and uprooted. Rooted poetry, rooted religious poetry, reproduces the experience of those poets who live their faith comfortably without crisis. Uprooted poetry is enunciated from the protest in different degrees to God and starts from a problematic belief in which God is frequently a theme, an object to which one turns in the face of an existentially tragic world. Dámaso Alonso himself was an uprooted poet who very early on stated, "I want to make it clear that my idea of God responds to the need to find a first cause that explains the world. The God that appears in my poetry does not belong to any religion. It is the name I give to that first cause." See how the religious poet, either rooted or uprooted, deals with God as an object, as a topic. There is almost no authentic, deep human, mystical experience in that kind of poetry. What is mystical poetry? Unlike Dámaso Alonso, Rielo would say that all poetry is mystical, given his mystical conception of a human being. But in reality, there are such minute degrees in this mystical condition in so many instances of poetry that Rielo knows that there is poetry that not only is not mystical, but can be pseudo-mystical and even anti-mystical and anti-religious. Rielo understands mystical poetry in two senses. This is a literal quotation from a text by Fernando Rielo. I'll just read because it is very clearly explained. The specific or full sense, so mystical poetry can be understood in two senses. One, the specific or full sense, and second, the general or incipient sense. The specific or full sense, which consists of conveying with sufficient poetic skill the different modes of a soul's intimate personal experience of union with God in love and pain. The Christian poet experiences this union in relation to the most blessed Trinity, the non-Christian poet in relation to God alone. The fullest exclusive consecration to supreme love, insofar as possible in this life, is what distinguishes mystical poetry from other poetic genres. Second, the general or incipient sense, which consists of conveying with supreme mastery the intimate experience of love with the absolute in the various modes of searching presented by the human being's spiritual inquietum cor. In this regard, I consider mysticism to be open, that is, incipient in all human beings because of the ontological fact that they are mystical beings rather than rational, political, or symbolic animals. Given these two senses of mystical poetry, it should be added that religious poetry, far from transmitting an authentic experience, even as a search, deals with God as a theme, a topic, an idea, as a cultural element, or as an object of vital reflection. Now I'll touch upon mystical poetry and its classical expression, which has been conveyed mainly by St. John of the Cross's poetry. It is well known that the classical expression of mystical poetry, at least in Spanish, and in a good part of Catholic mysticism, is conveyed to us in the poetry of St. John of the Cross, which is mystical poetry par excellence. This poetry has been studied in the last century by renowned scholars, the Spanish Emilio Orozco and Dámaso Alonso and the German Hispanist Helmut Hatzfeld. To such an extent, St. John's poetic work epitomizes classical literary mysticism that it can almost be said that with him, mystical poetry in Spanish reached its peak and was afterwards exhausted, for which San Juan is not to blame. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that St. John of the Cross ruined the development of mystical poetry. I'm saying that after reaching so high a peak, mystical poetry was left a unique model, that of St. John of the Cross's poetry. In fact, for more than 4 centuries, there was no other example of mystical poetry in Spanish poetry, in the strict sense mentioned above. Rielo announces this strange fact of a poetry that suddenly found itself distanced from culture and even from the Catholic Church. Let's look at the following quotation by Rielo. I'll just read the quotation. The slight impact of mystical poetry on international culture and the enormous void which has existed in broad sectors of the Church in this regard, we could say that it has been left dissociated from the world of culture, thought, and the arts. I can read you a passage which speaks for itself by the English lyrical poet Francis Thompson. The Church, which was once the mother of poets as well as saints, in the last 2 centuries has abandoned the most exquisite concern for poetry to outsiders. Poetry, in the broadest sense, though not avowedly irreligious, among a great many Catholics, has long encountered contempt or distrust. The feeling that it is at best superfluous, at worst harmful, and very often dangerous has been excessively marked and generalized. The dissociation was bad for poetry, it was not good for religion. Some of the resources St. John's mystical poetry used. St. John stylistically canonized mystical poetry in such a way that it was limited from the point of view of its maximum expression. The resources of this poetry are, in synthesis, according to Hatzfeld, the central metaphor of the bridal union or the marital union, the symbol of the dark night and the flame of love, the central resource of paradox, and the power of evocation. In the following, we will try to illustrate how Rielo has carried out with his poetry this task of renewal of mystical poetry. And I will follow these 4 general ideas. He has replaced the bridal metaphor by the filial relationship. He has contributed with a new idea of union, that is transverberated consciousness in a unitive dialogical poetry. He has transformed a stylistic paradox into an existential one, the pain of love. And finally, he's achieved a greater scope of the vision, of the poetic vision, openness to everything human. First of all, the bridal metaphor is replaced by the filial relationship. This is the feature that I believe to be the most important one in Rielo's poetry. It is striking and signifies a Copernican turn in the essential approach of a mystical poetry of the 20th century. Classical mysticism made the bridal or marital metaphor the center of poetic expression. As Hatzfeld has explained, the origin of this metaphor is the Song of Songs in the Old Testament, traditional symbol of the bridal relationship between God and the Jewish people, which later became the relationship between God and the Church. It is also influenced by the courtly poetry of Petrarchan origin. This marital metaphor became a pattern of images of a slightly erotic sense. It is true that the images are adequately spared in St. John's poetry, but there is the inconvenience that the poet of masculine gender is objectified in a feminine self before the beloved, who has to be masculine. In addition to this inconvenience, there is the circumstance that the bridal metaphor forces the poetic eye to identify with the soul which in Spanish is of feminine grammatical gender, in order to agree with the beloved. There is here a forced reduction of the interpersonal union with God to a mere union of essences. One author expresses it in the following way: mystical union is a loving interpenetration of spiritual essences, that is, that of the soul and that of God. The problem does not lie in what is stated, but in what is left out. The union with God is not that of a disincarnate soul with God, but that of man or woman in the unity of their nature with the divine person. The bridal pattern imposes, therefore, a certain artifice in the way of understanding mystical love. Faced with this metaphorical reality, Rielo's starting point in all his poetry is the filial relationship, in which there is no need to make grammatical gender impositions, nor to shy away from the integrity of the human condition. The poet longs lovingly for God from the totality of his being, not only from an immaterial essence. Moreover, the filial relationship refers back to the gospel, to the New Testament. This filial condition is one of the strongest teachings of the Gospels. Jesus feels himself to be, above all, the Son of God, intimately united to the Father, sent by him to carry out the mission God has entrusted to him. Christians, in the image of Jesus, are first and foremost children of God, although, of course, they establish with each divine persons a form of relationship: children of the Father, brothers of the Son, temples of the Holy Spirit. Rielo chooses the filial form of relationship with God, which does not exclude that sometimes he addresses the Son, Jesus Christ, but all his poetry is pervaded by a passion for the Father. Let us look at a poetic fragment from Sky Blue Weeping, a book he published in 1978. Son, I am for you God, Father, friend, and Son, if you ask me to. I am your beloved and your lover. You tell me so. If you feel me to be Father, everything is yours, my kingdom, my throne, and I myself. What more do you want? It is a poem that belongs, as I said, to Sky Blue Weeping. The form of filial relationship is full. I am your beloved and your lover. In love, one loves and is loved. It is full surrender. Everything is yours. And in the extreme of self-giving, God himself willing to be Son, that is, to put himself in the place of the beloved. Therefore, in the economy of salvation, God becomes man. In Rielo's poem, God becomes Son. If that is what the poet asks of him, the filial relationship leads to an enormous expressive freedom with respect to love. The second trait of renewal in Rielo's mystical poetry, the transverberated consciousness in a unitive dialogical poetry. Since Rielo's mystical poetry draws on Christian inspiration, there is absolutely no place for any pantheistic trace of dissolution of the self in a supposedly divine cosmos. Some authors are somewhat confused about the way they make sense of this, because Eastern mysticism, especially the Buddhist one, seeks union with the God who is the whole. The mystic's aspiration is to merge with the whole. In this sense, Hernández Villalba states, when the mystic lives this union, he finds himself with God as emptiness or as a whole that embraces him, and then he mentions, I am God, or God is nothing, statements that are very compromising in many religions. Let us say to understand that the Christian mystic, and therefore Rielo in his mystical poetry, stays away from two extremes. First, that of thinking of God as a mere projection of a poet's mind. How does he do it? By seeing God as a personal you, distinct from the poet's I, and both are counterparts with a voice of their own. Secondly, the second idea Rielo stays away from is conceiving God as a whole with which one must merge, and in the end, become confused because of a false idea of union. Union is wrongly interpreted as unity. Unity refers to one. Union requires two terms to be achieved. The Christian mystic does not aspire to unity with God, but to the most intimate union of love with him, without dissolving his human self in the divine self. True love does not erase the uniqueness of the lovers, but complements them and thus brings them to the fullness of love. To avoid this possible confusion of unity and union, Rielo uses the term transverberation, which has a tradition in mysticism. Transverberation is essential union between or among persons, which translates into an interpersonal dialogue of ontological depth, which does not always have to resort to the articulate speech. In any case, the speech as a verbal entity is a reflection of this dialogue. Let us see an example of this unity force in Rielo's poetry. This is a passage from Rielo's book, Bare Landscape, published in 1979. I am not satisfied with just seeing you when I remain exempt from death. Though the glance would be lovely, my soul would remain sad. My God, my destiny is to be eviscerated with you, to be recreated, to be beyond all solitude. The third feature in Fernando Rielo's renewal of mystical poetry, the existential paradox. Paradox is a key resource in mystical poetry. For Hatzfeld, it is a way of preventing marital symbolism from descending to the level of worldly love, so that symbolism is wrapped in a web of paradoxical obstacles. For Damaso Alonso, on the contrary, mystical paradoxes come from the pre-poetic Christian paradoxes and belong to the very essence of mysticism, in which to die is to live and to lose oneself is to gain. The latter is true. The language of the gospel is paradoxical. Anyone who finds his life will lose it. Anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. In the case of Fernando Rielo's poetry, there is beyond these concrete paradoxes an existential paradoxical state, which is revealed in a melancholic, sometimes tragic note in his poetry. He synthesizes it in the expression, the pain of love, which comes to mean that in this world, love is necessarily accompanied by pain. Rielo says, my sadness was the form of pain which always accompanied me. That is, to feel, or rather suffer, from the fact that my life in this world is an exile, more than an exile, an exodus. What has really made an impact on my work is what I call the pain of love at its very core, not other forms of pain. End of quote. This sadness comes, therefore, from the fact of not being able to consummate immediately the perfect love of God. In Rielo's poetry, there is a form of sadness that is sometimes regret, sometimes melancholy, or unfulfilled longing. Another quote can illustrate this melancholic tendency. It is said, it is a quotation by Rielo. It is said that God made St. Francis of Assisi in a moment of joy. As for myself, I say, God made me in a moment of sadness. There is a lovely line by Cesar Vallejo. I was born one day when God was ill, seriously, in which, in all modesty, I would make the following modification. I was born one day when God was sad, very sad. We continue with this trait in Fernando Rielo's poetry. Mystical poetry is a joyful but also painful expression of love for the divine persons. This paradox necessarily translates into a paradoxical state which responds to a true vital situation. To exemplify this fact, let us quote some verses of Rielo. Afflictions with afflictions, my sober coarse cloth interwoven, thread by thread wounds me with penitent pain. Where are the splendors whose source you were? Joyful brightnesses were your former style for me. Today, you have turned your light into fasting, and to pain's blade you consecrate me. Cry now to you fervently, for you to enlighten my dark faith with a touch on your brow, and touch with such touching as to make you my refuge. Father, I heard your voice. I want you to be the sadness of your incarnate brother on passing through the uncontrite world, estranging my truthful path. O touch of your touch. O such deep weeping, flowing from your love, love I require, so as to live, if it is living, a life of dying. As we can see, there are certain paradoxes in the poem. Life of dying, you have turned your light into fasting. To pain's blade you consecrate me, weeping flowing from your love. But the most important thing, over and above these concrete paradoxes, is the state of total contradiction in which the poet feels himself. The poet sees how God himself wants to consecrate him in sadness, to embody in this way the sadness of his incarnated Son. Sadness, pain, have here a broader meaning than being an expressive resource. They are in reality a mission, a way of understanding love, love betrothed to pain. Finally, the last trait in Rielo's poetry, a greater scope of the poetic vision, openness to everything human. Mystical poetry in its classical version is particularly introspective. It configures an ideal world, a poetic universe far from the vicissitudes of everyday life. This world springs from the effort of transfiguration that the poet gives to the inner realm of his loving and unitive experience. A consequence of this, which is clearly seen in St. John's poetry, is the stylization and exclusivity of the poetic realm, in which no human elements outside the poetic I and you, the protagonists of a loving union, enter. On the other hand, in Rielo's mystical poetry, there is room for all that is truly human, all the experience of man and women. The poet summons men and women, his brothers and sisters, and makes them part of his poetry. We don't have time to elaborate on all these human spheres present in Rielo's poetry, but a sample will suffice. A poem in which the author reproduces an encounter that took place in the New York hospital where he would go daily for his physical rehabilitation. In one of the sessions, he meets a young woman. This is a poem. This is a poem from his book of poetry, Broken Pain. I have met a lovely girl, blue eyes destined to live uniquely, butterflies on the whitest skin. She was suffering the tragedy of feet that had lost their name and was there for impossible treatment. How big was her gaze for so little earth, and how much earth to be just stepped on. This is the human being, weeping suspended between earth and heaven, an enigma of hope. For an enduring life, nothing will mutilate, and God will be the one to awaken him caressingly from dreaded death. In this short poem, Rielo masterfully combines the tragedy of mutilation in a beautiful young woman with an atmosphere of delicate sensitivity, to be all transfigured in a heavenly vision. The first stanza draws a picture of positive notes, youth, beauty, blue eyes, the happy destiny of those eyes. In the second stanza, the tragedy abruptly emerges. The young woman has lost both feet. The impossible therapy drastically closes this segment of strong contrast. The last stanza leaps into a vision that is no longer of this world. Here is the center. The center is not now occupied by the girl of the first stanza, but by the universal human person with their tragedy and their destiny. It is a mystical poem of solidarity and closeness to human pain and of aspiration towards a hopeful end. Finally, this is the last slide. My conclusions, I'll just list them. They are 6 conclusions. First, mystical poetry is distinguished from religious, anti-religious, and anti-mystical poetry. Second, religious poetry deals with God as a topic from a more or less deep-rooted search. Mystical poetry recreates the love union of the poet and the divine persons. Then, Rielo frees mysticism from the phenomenological sphere and raises it up to ontology. Then, Rielo renews Spanish mystical poetry after centuries of stagnation. And finally, the poetic renewal of Rielo revolves around the way of understanding the love relationship, the filial versus the bridal, in the breadth of the human experience that collects, and the fact of approaching the union of love from the transverberated consciousness, in addition to assimilating with hope the paradox of human existence. This is the end. Thank you very much for listening.